right, thank you guys. Thank you for coming out on this Saturday morning and putting in some time to learn something new. My name's Sean. I talked a little bit about myself, but I grew up in the Cleveland area. I went to University of Dayton. I was actually an economics major and kind of pivoted careers into software development about 3 or 4 years ago. Today I live in German Village in Columbus, and I work on the nationwide SharePoint team. Some of my professional interests are C#, Node, Angular. React is kind of like the next thing on my to-do list here. And some other stuff I'm into: traveling, hiking, music, books, and ping pong. Although I guess everyone's kind of into traveling. Is there anyone here that does not enjoy traveling? Okay. Really? I almost took that out. I was like, okay, I'll leave it. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to go through a little bit of background on JavaScript frameworks. I think that'll be especially beneficial for people who aren't really in this ecosystem. Just a little bit of, foundation. We'll look back at Angular 1.x, and when I say 1.x, I'll probably say that a lot. I mean versions 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, the whole first iteration of Angular. So we'll look at some pros and cons of Angular 2, key ideas, some of the tooling, and there is a lot of tooling around Angular 2, as well as TypeScript. And then we'll take a little break. Hopefully by that time I'll have enough coffee in me to do a good code demo. I'm not going to do a lot of live code, but we'll walk through some sample components, and we'll try to get you guys a good idea of how this stuff's working. So a little bit about JavaScript frameworks. So as we all know, JavaScript is the language of the web. It's really exploded in popularity over the past 5, 7, maybe 5 to 10 years. And a lot of that has had to do with the introduction of frameworks. So JavaScript frameworks are going to give us some structure to our projects. They're also going to give us useful abstractions. Without frameworks, it can be really difficult to keep your code neat and organized, and you'll end up reinventing the wheel. If you try to write just vanilla JavaScript, the odds are that you'll end up inventing your own framework. This ecosystem is changing really rapidly, especially over the past 4 or 5 years. We have all these different frameworks. We have React, Angular, Ember, Backbone. And has anyone in here heard the term JavaScript fatigue? This idea that for developers, front-end developers, we're basically being asked to learn a new framework every year or two. There's this flavor of the month kind of mentality. So it kind of makes sense to take some time before you dive all the way in and learn if this is really something that you want to focus on. So this is just a little graphic that kind of shows that. These are all different JavaScript frameworks and libraries that have been popular throughout the years. 2014 was Angular 1 was the only framework. And then 2015, React kind of came around and just exploded in popularity. So now that Angular 2 is almost ready for production, it's going to be interesting to see which of those two kind of wins out. And here's our React logo up here, facing off against our Angular guys down here.
I tried to put that same picture in my presentation.
Really?
Yeah. I couldn't fit it in though.
Oh, okay. I think it's funny. By the way, is this John C. Reilly right here? It kind of looks like him.
I don't think so.
No?
No.
But anyways. So why did they feel that there was a need to to write Angular 2. What was wrong with Angular 1.x? It's important to remember that Angular 1.x is still really useful, and it's going to be around for a long time. I think it's still worth learning. But there was some room to improve, especially to make some of the concepts a little easier to digest. You had a lot of different ways to accomplish the same thing. So we had all these questions of like what logic goes in the controller versus the directive versus services, and those are all Angular 1 terms. We had this concept of scope, which was how we bound our view to our model. And these scopes were objects that would inherit from each other using prototypical inheritance, but they could get really confusing. Like if you had nested scopes, the hierarchy of how they inherited was just really confusing at times. Custom directives could be really confusing. And also Angular 1 didn't enforce a one-to-one coupling of view and behavior. And that's something that Angular 2 does, and it makes it a lot easier to reason about your app. And so actually, I've actually heard this idea of you should make every single thing a directive in Angular 1. And when I heard that, I was kind of like, well, that's basically making a component. You're making a one-to-one coupling between a view and behavior. And so that is what Angular 2 does. So if you were an Angular 1 guy, these are some of the concepts that are kind of dead now. Controllers, scope, jQuery Lite, DDO, which is the directive definition object, is that right? Just the way you define directives, and Angular.module, all gone, so RIP. Some of the benefits of Angular 2. So again, we don't have controllers, we don't have scope. That makes it a little bit simpler. What we're basically doing is we're building JavaScript classes, or in our case, TypeScript classes. So here, an important thing to note while we're on this is you can write JavaScript, plain JavaScript, with Angular. You can also write Dart, but the Angular dev team has kind of taken the approach of TypeScript being the right way to do this. So they actually wrote the framework in TypeScript. The docs seem to get updated quicker in TypeScript. It's really a first-class citizen in Angular 2. And we'll talk more about TypeScript later. Another cool benefit is that Angular 2 embraces web standards. So we do these property bindings and event bindings. So we're actually, instead of writing these like weird directives like ng-click, we're binding directly to the click event. And we'll see how that works later. And same with HTML properties. Since we are using classes, this can be a little bit easier for people with an object-oriented background, like if you're a Java guy or a C# girl, whatever. You might find this a little bit easier to wrap your head around. Our components are going to have clearly defined inputs and outputs, and that's another thing that makes it easier to reason about, easier to predict how a component will behave. We also have a more standardized project structure, and again, TypeScript embraced. Some of the TypeScript tooling is really awesome. So here's one of the key ideas of Angular 2. We have this tree of components. We have our root component, which we call app component, and then a tree of subcomponents coming off of that. And we can pass data down through that tree or also fire it back up. And for people who did Angular 1, a component will look just like an Angular 1 directive. So it'll be like a custom piece of HTML that you define what it looks like. So a component is simply just a class plus this @component metadata. We have property bindings, which we just talked about a little bit. And we can use property bindings to pass data from our parent to our child component. So here's an example of a property binding. We have this image element with a source property, and we're binding directly to that. And we can define whatever we want in our TypeScript class or our JavaScript class to tell it what this URL is. Whoops. And then here's an example of using those bindings. So in this case, we call this an input binding. This is a subcomponent right here. So we're passing the current user in whatever context we're in right now. We're passing it down into this child component using this binding. So we're saying our current user is going to be the username in this user detail component. We also have event bindings, so click, hover, stuff like that. If you were an Angular 1 person, this would be something like ng-click, but now we can just bind directly to the click event, and then we can attach it onto this method that we define in our TypeScript class or JavaScript class. A couple other key ideas. So we have services in Angular 2. This was really confusing in the first version of Angular because we had all these ways to do services. We had factory, provider, services, and they really all were doing similar things. So in Angular 2, it's just services now. They kind of accomplish the same thing, but they're just simplified a little bit. And then we also have dependency injection, which is how we're going to inject our services into the components where they need to be used. We have a component router, which is how we're going to set up our mapping and navigation throughout the app. And then we have this idea of lifecycle hooks. So what that is basically an interface. Angular is going to let you implement this interface, and each one of the interfaces has a single method that you will implement. So the one we'll look at today, for example, it's called ng-on-init. And what that's going to do is say, when this component fires up, whatever I want to happen right at the beginning of the component lifecycle, I'll put in this function. So we'll see how that works in our demo. A couple other features. So we have a module loader now. A big complaint about Angular 1 was you couldn't do lazy loading. So you ended up with like all these script tags that you're importing, and it got kind of ugly and confusing. So now we have a module loader. They will default you to System.js, but I don't know why they made that choice. I think Webpack is kind of the more popular, like kind of industry standard at this point. But either way, you now have a module loader. We have this idea of zones. We won't get too far into this, but these are basically they're basically overriding certain browser APIs, like add event listener, and then they're using that to allow change detection. You won't have to know a whole lot about zones to get started, but if you do end up getting deeper into this, it's something you'll need to know. You have Augury, which is a debugging tool. It's a Chrome extension. And what Augury is going to do for you is let you see your whole tree of components and how your components are interacting. And also you have the Angular CLI. So if you guys have ever used Yeoman, has anyone heard of Yeoman or used Yeoman? It's a really cool tool that it's a CLI tool. So you say like Yeoman, generate me this route or service or whatever. It's going to be just like that, except it's going to be standardized, and actually the Angular team is actually working on this. So you'll be able to say like ng generate component, ng generate route, service, whatever. And that will be really useful because there is a lot of setup code, which you guys will see as we get into this. So TypeScript. TypeScript, I think it's kind of like a love it or hate it kind of thing. It's statically typed JavaScript. And how this is going to work is it's going to compile back to ECMAScript 5, which is the version of JavaScript that every browser can run right now. So what TypeScript does is it follows along with ECMAScript 6 or ES 2015, which is the latest version of JavaScript that not every browser can implement all the features of it yet. So it'll give you all those features, and then it'll also give you the ability to add custom types, which is really useful. The reason that's useful, a lot of errors can be caught during this compile step by the IDE. So there's a whole class of bugs that pretty much just gets wiped out by having compile time type checking. You also have IntelliSense now, which is really nice. That's something that I know a lot of people coming from a statically typed language over to JavaScript kind of complain about, is like your IntelliSense is just gone. The drawback is it is just one more thing to learn. It is a little bit time consuming to learn, and it adds a compile step. It's also a little bit trickier to debug because you have to set up source maps, but I don't think that's too big a deal that it should actually stop you from using TypeScript. I personally actually like it a lot so far. And then this is just a kind of ridiculous image I found on the internet. I don't know what they were going for here, if that's Abraham Lincoln or what, but. So should my team use Angular 2? I think I just Googled Angular 2 and TypeScript. So should my team use Angular 2? I know this is something that my team's looking at right now. Like Angular 1 is like kind of starting to not fade away, but you know, it's getting a little bit outdated, I guess. Do we go to React or do we go to Angular or something else? The answer is Angular 2, not yet. So even like during the time I was making this presentation over the past couple weeks, there were like pretty major changes happening. The status of where they're at right now, so they're out of beta release and they're in release candidate 5. That's the one that just came out like last week. They still have, I'm guessing, at least a few months until it's in like a production version. But from the people I've talked to have said that they wouldn't really feel safe starting to use this for like another like, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 months. Especially if you're going to be in like a large corporate environment where they're really risk averse. You might not be able to use Angular for another year, or Angular 2, I'm sorry. Yeah, it was kind of frustrating because I would write these code samples and then like a bunch of stuff just changed and I had to go back and rewrite it. So it is a pretty big investment of your developer's time to learn this framework. So if you guys already have a framework that's working well for you, I'd say stick with it for now. Quite a bit of cognitive overhead at startup. Again, that's something that the Angular CLI should help a little bit with, but I really think it is overkill for a small app. If you're building, you know, like a web page that is like a single form, I don't think that would justify using Angular 2. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but Angular 1.5 is a newer version of the old version of Angular, and what that does is allows you to use components in a slightly different way. That might be a good way to transition if you have a team that you're thinking you might eventually start using Angular 2. starting to think in components and think about building components, this might be a good idea. So this is just, you know, you might not need this framework for a simple web page. Okay. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay.
I did some mics up for you guys. If you do have a question, please use the microphone. There's one there, one there. So if you just raise like your hand, if that's stupid to do, we can have the microphone make sure it's unmuted.
Just so it's recorded.
Yeah.
That's the main thing.
Yeah. It's just for show.
All right, cool. So let's get into the meat of this a little bit. So this is what a simple component is going to look like. So starting from the top, we have this import statement, and this is a TypeScript import statement. It's basically following the ECMA 2015 import standard. So we're grabbing this component decorator, and then we have our component metadata right here. So our selector is what this thing is actually going to look like. When we put this into HTML, it'll be like bracket, my app, end bracket. Like this is our HTML element when we use this. We have our template, which right now is just a single one-way binding right here. And where this title is coming from, where this title is coming from is right here. So we have our app component class. This is a TypeScript class with a single title property. It's of the type string, and it is just saying hello world. So when this thing renders, you get a pretty good idea of what it's going to look like. It's a single h1 header tag with hello world in it. Does that seem pretty intuitive so far? Cool. So here's a little bit more complex component. And just so you understand what this is kind of doing, so a lot of times in web development, we'll have this master detail pattern. So we'll have something like a list of users or whatever, some type of objects. So say we have a list of users, we click on one user, and then we can see some details about that user, maybe edit the details, and then go back to the list. So this component is the detail view in that master detail pattern.
Make that a little bit bigger.
Yeah. Oh. Sorry. Command plus does not want to work.
You hold down Control and then scroll up. I think it's disabled by default.
Yeah, sorry. Can everyone see this okay? And I think do you guys all have the copies of the slides I sent out this morning? Cool.
I also threw it in the front end Slack channel, so if you
Cool.
see it.
Okay, so this is a little bit more complex component. What we're doing here is we are importing component. We're also importing this input module, and we're importing hero, which is a class that we've defined in some other file. We have our selector again, so how this thing is going to actually render. And then we have our template, which is a little bit more complex than the last one. The important thing to look at here is that we have our input. Oh. Uh-oh. I messed up now. Okay. Cool. So we have this input here, and we're saying when this component is fired up, it's expecting to be passed a hero. By the way, the Angular framework billed itself as a super heroic JavaScript framework. It's just like a weird inside joke kind of thing. And so the tutorial we're going to be looking at today, it's using heroes, which if that's too exciting for you, you can just pretend they're users or something else. But we have this input hero, and basically we're saying this component needs to be passed down a hero. So its parent component has to give it a hero. If it doesn't get that hero, it just doesn't know what to do. So wherever we're getting it from doesn't matter, just we know that we have it now. And now that we have it, we can do some interesting stuff with it. So we can go up here and we can render the hero. This ngIf is basically saying render this component if this hero exists, if it's truthy, as we say. Once we know that hero exists, we're going to render the hero's name. We're going to render the hero's ID. And these double braces they should look familiar if you've done any Angular 1. It's just one-way data binding, also called interpolation. And then the other thing that's going on here is this ng model. So this is two-way data binding, which Angular 1 got kind of a lot of flack for because it does make for some kind of confusing data flows, but they call this the banana in a box model in Angular 2 because apparently this bracket, paren bracket, looks like a banana in a box. So what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to edit this hero's name, and it's also going to change every other instance of that property. Let's see. So you guys want to take a quick break real quick? Do you care if I take a quick break? And then we'll get into the demo. Any questions so far?
So when you made the component earlier,
Mm-hmm.
you made a property for title. So in your first demo, you have the property title there. Does TypeScript use public variables by default? And is that why it's exposed to the DOM?
I believe they're private by default, but you're allowed to use them in that template.
Okay. My next question is, with Angular 1, you'd use scope, or you could use a local variable that wasn't exposed to the view using scope. Is there a way to do that in Angular 2?
Say that again? Sorry.
So in Angular 1, you're able to create a scope variable, and then that makes it so it's available in the view.
Yeah.
But you can also make local variables that aren't exposed to the view.
Oh, I see.
In Angular 2?
I'm sure you can. That might be how this is actually working. So they might be private by default. I can get back to you on that. Are there any TypeScript folks in here, by chance? So, for the most part, things that we have in this class are going to be things that we want to render in the view. If they're not, we generally want to keep them in services, but that is a very good question. Let's see. I guess we can just keep rolling through if you guys are ready to go. So about the demo we're going to do today. This is roughly going to follow the tutorial from the official documentation, and I did this not out of laziness, but for the sake of you guys being able to go in later on, if there are questions you have, to be able to get more detailed answers. The documentation is way better than it was in Angular 1. It reads like it was intended for humans to read, which is really nice. No live code, maybe a little bit, but and we basically separated this demo out into several phases. So each phase will kind of learn a new technique or concept. So again, we're going to be going with the hero theme. And yeah, I hope this format works out for you guys. I think it'll be really helpful if you decide you want to get further into this later on. So down farther in this slide, you'll see links so we can follow along. We're using Plunker today, which is a online code editing tool. So a note about how we have this set up. You typically wouldn't want to have your TypeScript be like compiling in the browser. For the sake of this demo, I thought it was easier than like having you guys clone a bunch of GitHub repos or branches, but you typically will want to have your TypeScript like running on a local server and watching for changes and recompiling. What we're going to build, we'll have a smoke test. So this will be, has everyone heard that term, smoke test? We're just going to make sure everything is working, make sure all our setup code is legit, and make sure we can render a very simple view, and then from there we're good. We're going to have what we call a hero editor, and that's a single component that will allow us to view and edit a single hero. From that point, we're going to kind of build out this master detail pattern. So we'll have our list of all our heroes, and from there, the editor that we built in the previous step, that will become our detail view. Now that we have a master and detail view, we're going to break them out into separate components, and we're going to show how we pass data from one component to the other. And then if we get time, we'll get into some services, moving our code that is making HTTP calls or gathering data for us out into a separate service. Okay. Let's see. All right. Cool. All right. So let's start looking at a little bit of code now. We have our smoke test. This is one component doing nothing but rendering this single, I think it's an H1 tag. So let's start by looking at index.html. Traditionally, you'd see a bunch of libraries loaded in here. So you'd see like Angular, whatever stuff you'd be loading into your index.html. We're not going to do that here. What we're going to do instead is we're going to have this system.import, and that system.js, our module loader, is going to go out and get our files for us that we need. So it's saying system.import app. So where is this app? In the system.js config, this is where we're going to define stuff like this. So we're going to tell system.js where to find all these things. And you'll see that app actually maps to this file called main.ts. So let's come look at main.ts. And over here is where we're actually bootstrapping our app module. I can try again. Is that better? One more?
Yeah.
So what we're doing here is we're bootstrapping this app module. We're just building a simple web app, so we're using this platform browser dynamic to bootstrap. So if you wanted to use a different platform, so say you wanted to make like a mobile app with native script or Ionic or something like that, you'd be bootstrapping the module a little bit differently. But for our purposes today, we're just using platform browser dynamic. And so where is this app module? So it's importing the app module from this file app.module. And these are configured to add the .js for you. So you don't need to put like .ts, .js at the end of all of these, as long as your system config is set up that way. So let's see, app module, and this is the thing that they added like last week. This is called ng module, and what this is doing is finally telling Angular where we're going to start our app. So we are bootstrapping app component, and that is where we'll actually start writing our application code. We also have imports and declarations. Our imports are the other modules that export material that we need in this module. So almost any app will import browser module. Our declarations are when we create new components in our project, or our module, we need to declare them so that other modules can access them. So now we finally get to app component, and this is where we'll actually start writing some code. So this is kind of similar to the component I showed you in that slide. We have our import of our component, our component decorator right here, some metadata about our component, what it's going to look like in the HTML, and then a very simple template. And then we're exporting this app component so that it can be used in other places. Like, for example, right here. So it does seem like kind of a crazy amount of overhead to get started up, but from this point on, it is pretty simple, but it's a lot of configuration, more than you typically see in like a JavaScript project, I think. Does anyone agree with that? I think the Angular CLI will kind of help with this. Being able to just generate a project, like a starter project, and have some of this stuff wired up for you, I think would be very helpful. So we'll see where that goes. Okay, so let's go on and create our hero editor. Maybe. Why can't I drag this guy? Okay, so let's take a look at the UI that we have right now. We still have this title up here, but now we have our single hero. His name is Windstorm. He has two properties, an ID and a name. One of them is one-way bound, data bound. The other is two-way data bound. So this name is a two-way data binding. You can come in here and type whatever you want, and you should see it get propagated. Our index.html is going to look exactly the same. Our main.ts, exactly the same. Our app module, we are importing this forms module. This input is part of forms module. Even it's just the way they decided to break these things out so that if you're not using every part of the Angular framework, you can just import which parts you need. Other than that, this file should be pretty much the same. And then most of the changes are here in our app component. So what we've done here is we've defined our hero class. We've given him two properties, an ID of the type number and name of the type string. Down here, we've said one of the properties of our app component is this hero, which is of the type hero, which we just defined up here. And we're initializing these properties, ID to 1 and name to Windstorm. Up here, we're doing a simple one-way binding to that title, and then a one-way binding to the hero's name and ID. And then down here is the banana in the box two-way binding. So that's what's going to allow us to change the name property on that hero. And you'll notice we also have some CSS here in the styles.css. So this is global styling that will apply to every component throughout our app. What we'll see later on is that we can actually have, in addition to template here, we can have a styles metadata property. And that will allow us to define some CSS that will apply only to that component. That CSS won't leak out to surrounding components. It seems like a really nice feature because you end up not having to come up with all these crazy naming conventions to keep your classes straight and use like important all the time. So that is that. Oh, I also wanted to show you guys real quick while we're here. Let's take a look at pipes. Can I restart this? So if you ever used Angular 1, you'll remember we had these pipes or filters. So let's pretend like we got this data back and it was all uppercase, our title. We want to display it as lowercase, and we don't want to do a lot of work. We can just create this pipe, lowercase, and it magically will convert it back for us. So that stayed pretty much the same from Angular 1. It's really handy, especially for like dates and currency, if you're formatting things like that. Just makes your life easier as a developer.
Are there a bunch of built-in functions in Angular, like lowercase and then it's
Those pipes, yeah.
instead of calling like two lowercase on it?
What's that?
So like in vanilla JavaScript you would call like dot two lowercase.
Oh.
And so you just pipe it to I'm guessing a function called lowercase. Is that like are those built-in like helpers?
I'm not sure how they implement it behind the scenes.
Do you know if the documentation has like a list of what you can do?
Yeah, they do. I was actually going to show you guys that real quick. Angular 2 pipes. I don't know if this is going to be a good list. So one thing they did get rid of was custom filters. those, in my opinion, those always got kind of complicated, but
Did they do that recently? Because I think when I was playing around with Angular 2, when it was in beta still, they still had custom types.
really, I just read about this last night, and oh, look at that. Oh, maybe it was custom filters I'm thinking of.
Well, I know they got rid of a lot of the ones that got abused.
Okay.
The searching like with an NG model.
Okay. That makes sense. So somewhere in these docs, there's like a list of like every single pipe you can use. I thought it was in here, but
I'll try and find it.
okay, cool. Yeah, those are really handy. Okay, so moving on to our master detail view. So this is the next phase. We basically now we have this pattern of we have a list of users or heroes, whatever. We can click each one and we can see some details about them. And how are we going to accomplish this? So let's take a look back through our files. You'll see, again, our index hasn't changed. All we have is our initial root component, our app component. Our main.ts, exactly the same. Our app module, exactly the same. And then our changes will be, for the most part, in this app component. So we still have our hero class. Now what we're introducing here is this array of hero objects. This is kind of simulating like how we would get data back from a server call. So we call some JSON endpoint, we get back an array of objects, and then we go do something with it. This is, for now, it's just going to be sitting right in this file. Later on, we'll move it out, but and what we're going to do basically is iterate over this array and get some data from each one of these objects, and then display it in this list. So how are we going to get this heroes array available to our template? What we're going to do is just create this property on our app component class and set it equal to heroes. So later on we'll refactor that a little bit, but for now we just want to get these heroes and be able to do something with them. So now that we have the heroes here, we can iterate over them. And how we're going to do that is what we call a structural directive called ng4. This is how we're going to loop over a collection or an array. The syntax is kind of strange. It's a little bit different if you're used to Angular 1 syntax, the ng repeat. We're going to say let hero of heroes. So we have this array, and what we're saying is go stamp out a bunch of instances of this list item, and in each one use this local variable hero as the hero that we're getting data from. We can also say we can use this property binding here for class.selected. So this is basically saying if our hero is the selected hero, so this is an expression here. If that hero is the selected hero, apply this class called selected that we define down here. And down here, this is an example of using styles directly in the component. I'm kind of a fan of this syntax. I think it's kind of nice being able to see like the CSS and HTML and JavaScript all in one place, but some people have different opinions about that. We can move these to separate files, in which case we'd make this like style, I think it's style URL, and then we would just point this to we would just point this to a file path. So how are we going to get, like now that we have iterated over all these heroes, we have this whole list, how are we going to get this data of like which hero is the selected one? How are we going to pass that down into our child component? What we have here is this event binding on the click on this list item. And we're going to call this onSelect method that we defined down below in our TypeScript class. And we're going to pass in the current hero. So this is that method we define. We pass in a hero who is of the type hero. We're saying the return type on this method is void. And then we're setting this.selected hero equal to that hero that we passed in. So selected hero is a property that we defined right here. And we're just saying like when this person clicks on it, put that value into our current selected hero. So now that we have a current selected hero, what we can do is this portion of the DOM, which is like the hero detail component. We're rendering the name and the ID of our selected hero. And once again, we still have our ng model, which is our two-way data binding, where we can change the name of the hero right here. Any questions on that? I know that was kind of a lot of stuff in that one transition there, but
for the style, the array of styles that are in your component,
yeah,
is that stuff that gets turned into JavaScript and then applied through JavaScript statements, or is that like shadow DOM stuff going on?
So someone asked me this question. I actually did this presentation for my team yesterday, and someone asked me this question of how this is actually implemented, and I meant to look it up, and I did not. So I apologize. Does anyone else have an answer to that by chance?
It just injects a style element directly into the HTML with all the styles. And then it uses attributes to namespace them properly.
Okay.
I also have a question. For the click event, is there a way to expose like the normal DOM event object to the onSelect function? So like if we had like an anchor element that we wanted to, prevent default on?
I believe there is. I'm not sure exactly. I know you can pass in the syntax they use is like $event, but I'm not sure exactly how they implemented that. Let's see. So hopefully this so far makes some sense. It is. I think it is really nice just to like be able to see this thing and like know what's going on by looking at one file, as opposed to like hunting down like your chain of scopes. And at this point now we have two like pieces of functionality, and they really shouldn't be together in the same component. So we have this list, but we also have our little detail component. And we want to be able to reuse this this piece of functionality. The way we have this set up right now, it's not possible because we have all of this stuff right here just in the same component. So what we're going to do now is break that out a little bit. Yep. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do to start out is we're going to break out our hero class that we defined. I was actually wondering if there are any TypeScript people in here. Do you know why they made this a class and not an interface? 'Cause it seems like they could have done either, but.
What do you mean?
So I'm pretty sure they could have just used an interface for hero. And I actually saw earlier versions of the docs where they did do that, and then they changed their minds all of a sudden, and I was kind of wondering what their thought process was. But anyway, so we have our hero broken out. He's in his own file now, and he's exporting class hero. And now we have a hero detail component. So basically what we did was we took that code that was implementing our detail view, and we just moved it over to its own component. We put all that stuff in this template, and this is kind of similar to that example I showed you guys in the beginning. We have this input property, so we're expecting a hero. This class needs a hero to function, and it's just expecting to be passed that hero. Where we're actually going to do that is up here. Oh, sorry. So this is our first child component that we've created. And this is the component we were just looking at, my hero detail. What we're doing is that we're passing our current selected hero using this input binding to hero. So what this is saying is the hero in my hero detail is going to be equal to the selected hero in this context, in the app.component context. Does that make sense? And so that's one way that we can pass data from a parent component down to a child. Let's see. So yeah, you'll notice that nothing has really changed with this template. We pretty much just copy pasted it from app component down to here. We did change this selected hero to be hero because now that it's coming into us from a parent, we can rename it and alias it to whatever we like. And it seems to make more sense to just call it hero. The other things that we have to remember are this input. If you don't call this as a function, if you don't put the parens afterwards, it will break mysteriously. And they even say that in the docs. If you leave one of those off, your app will just error out, and it doesn't have a good warning message or anything. So make sure you always remember those parens there. And then the other thing we have to do is, now that we created a new component here, we want to declare it in our app module. So we just say hero detail component. Sorry, we import from the hero detail component file, and then we declare it right here. Cool, so at this point we created this reusable component. We learned how to make it accept an input. We declared this application directive that we need in this module. And we just learned how to bind components to each other. So the next section that we're going to get into is services. Is everyone feeling comfortable with what we've covered so far? More or less? A little bit? Okay. I think we're going to do one more phase here, and for the sake of keeping this easy to digest, we're going to look at services and dependency injection and lifecycle hooks. Okay. So before we had our array of all our hero objects, we had that directly just sitting in our app component. That's not really realistic. So like if we were doing this in real life, we would be getting that data from a server somewhere. And it's not really the component's job to be like making those kinds of decisions for us. Like getting data, doing complex business logic, stuff like that. We should be moving that into a service. And we don't have multiple types of service like factory, provider, or whatever. We just have service. So what we changed here was we moved all these mock heroes, all this data, we just moved it into its own class. And so still not 100% realistic, but at least it's a little bit more realistic. This could kind of represent like a JSON endpoint that we'd be hitting to get this data. Again, we're importing hero because we need to let this array know what type its heroes are. We have a hero service, and actually we have two hero services. So they showed you kind of like a more naive implementation and then like a more complicated one. The one way you can do this is just create a getHeroes method, which returns an array of heroes, and simply import those heroes. And then we have to have this @injectable decorator in our services. That's going to give TypeScript some metadata about like if that service needs other things injected into it. At the moment, we don't need to inject anything into our service that's existing, but apparently it's best practice to just put this decorator in there, just in case. Let's see. So our getHeroes method, if you guys are curious, a little bit more complex way of implementing that, or sorry, a promise-based way of implementing it is like this. So we're saying our getHeroes method returns a promise of an array of heroes. So we're saying go get all these heroes, and then once that operation is completed, then come back to us, and we'll use that data and actually display it. So this is an example of a promise that's resolving instantaneously. It's like pretend we have a 0 latency server, and we just have this data like almost instantly. They wanted to show you another method where you basically have a slow connection. So right here they actually just set a timeout and they made this delay for 2 seconds, just to show you like how a promise is getting you data while you can still do other things. So now in our, let's see. Now that we have this hero service and it's getting our data, we need to get it into our app component and make it available so we can actually use it. And so this part gets a little bit confusing. I'm still kind of trying to understand some of the finer points of it, but this is where we get into dependency injection. So now that we have this hero service, we imported the hero service, and now we have it. How do we actually make it available? So we don't want to just new it up. We want to inject it into our service. The first thing we're going to have to do that is create this providers in our component metadata and give it hero service in this array. So we're saying like, hey Angular, we're going to inject this hero service. Here it is. And then what we're going to do is create a constructor with the private hero service property and make it of that type hero service. So now we finally have this thing available to us. We can call it. And what we're going to do is create a method, our own method called getHeroes. It's going to make a call to the getHeroes method that we defined over in our hero service. And it's going to, since we returned a promise in one of those implementations, we can say .then, so when this data is returned, then go do this stuff. And in our then, what we're doing is setting this .heroes equal to the heroes that we got back. So this guy right here. Does that make sense? I think that is like the most complicated part so far. It might make a little bit more sense if you have like an object-oriented background, but and then finally, so how do we want to actually make this data call? Like, when do we want this thing to get triggered? In our case, as soon as the app loads, as soon as our component renders, that's when we want the component to like get its data, when we want the hero service to give us data. So what we're going to do to accomplish that is this lifecycle hook. This is called ng-on-init. And to use it, we have to first import on-init. And then our class needs to implement this interface. And the interface is just contains a single method, which is on-init. No return, or sorry, the return type is void. And then in this guy, we can just put like anything we want to happen right when the component boots up. We can just throw it right in there. And in our case, what we want to happen is to go get our data so that we can render it in our template. Another like nice thing is that with TypeScript, since it does follow ES6 or ES 2015 for the most part, we can use arrow functions. So this is the fat arrow or arrow function. It makes the syntax a little bit more clear, I think, in this case. So yeah, and do we have any questions about how that's working? So what do you guys think about this framework so far? Just from looking at it for an hour.
Big improvement.
Yeah?
Yeah.
What? Yeah.
I was just curious, how would this be different? Because you talked about TypeScript compiling on the server and what you deploy versus what we see here. How would this be different if we were actually deploying this in production? Would we see all this same stuff, or what does that look like?
Yeah, so what I was saying is here the compile step is being handled by Plunker somehow, and I have no idea how they actually implement that, but what we want to happen is that we want to control the compile step. So we want to see our actual files, like TypeScript files, being compiled to JavaScript, because that's where we'll catch a lot of errors. With this setup, we can't really do that. And we also don't get like IntelliSense or anything like that.
But you would deploy JavaScript, you wouldn't deploy TypeScript?
Correct. Yes. Let's see.
usually you'd have some kind of. I think usually you'd have some kind of step like a gulp task or something to run TypeScript locally, and then it transpiles it to JavaScript, and then you deploy that to your server.
I have a hard time understanding what goes in the decorator versus what goes in the class. Can you provide some sort of rhyme or reason
So why they put certain things in there?
Yeah. So like especially for instance, like why the providers are in the decorator instead of just like being instantiated in the class constructor.
Yeah, I really think a lot of that was kind of preference. It seems like it is kind of weird because most of the stuff that's in the decorator is like template oriented, like your styles and you know, your like selector. Some of that stuff doesn't really make sense. The providers specifically. So I was actually reading this morning. They have their team weekly release meeting notes, and they sound like they might actually change that, which I don't know. It's confusing. They actually used to have another property in there called directives that you'd put in the same place as that providers. So right here you'd have another property that was directives, and then we'd have to list out so we use My Hero Detail, so we would have actually had to list out all the components that we use in this component, and they scrapped that like a week or two ago. So I think that some of that stuff's kind of shifting around still. They're kind of trying to figure it out. But no, I cannot say why they chose to do it that way.
I'm just curious because I feel like you keep talking about how much you read. How many hours a week do you actually spend reading about Angular? Especially Angular 2 at this point.
In preparation for this talk, quite a few.
Yeah.
And if I don't sound like an expert, it's because I'm not, because I'm not sure that I, as a developer, if I want to fully commit to Angular 2 yet. I'm kind of still testing the waters, if you know what I mean. So I think over the next month or so, I'm going to kind of deep dive into React, and at that point, then decide which one I want to focus more on.
I've asked Brady this before, but the pieces and parts about Angular 2 that you like or that you think are exciting, is it Angular 2 or is it actually ECMA 2015 and 2016 actually being put to good use?
I think it's that, and I think it's just having written Angular 1 for so long, they did keep a lot of the stuff is familiar still, bindings and services. Just I think the component-based model is a good idea, and I think that's something that they kind of took inspiration from React in building. So do we have any people here who've written a lot of React or a decent amount of React? Have you written a decent amount of React? Okay. I was just, so as someone who's, well, no, I've peeked at React, but I haven't really written much of it.
Actually, I didn't get too far into React before I started using Vue, actually.
Oh, really? Okay.
Vue.js is pretty much an open, well, I shouldn't say open source because React is open source, but it's an open source community-driven alternative to React because, React is mostly by Facebook, and so they make the calls on it.
Okay.
Vue.js is fully built by the open source community, and it's gaining a lot of traction. But it's a similar style. It is a kind of front-end engine, or sorry, I should say a Vue engine mixed with the Flux architecture pattern.
Okay.
And so there's Vue, and there's Vuex is pretty much their Flux implementation, similar to Redux for React.
Gotcha.
But
So is that the one that was spawned from Aurelia, or are they two separate?
Those are still two separate.
Okay.
Yeah, now, if it was originally like forked from it, I don't know.
Okay.
But UGS started as I do know that it was started by one guy though, and now of course
Okay.
it's grown a lot, and the whole community is kind of contributing to it.
Okay.
I feel like it takes a lot of React concepts and makes them a lot simpler. And actually, Vue 2, which is it's kind of like in the same stage as like Angular 2.
Yeah.
Performance-wise, beats out React in like almost every single step, including they've added like a virtual DOM and everything else too.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I think another one of the knocks on React that I had like a year ago was that it seemed like you had to kind of like cobble together like all these different libraries just to get it working. Because like React itself, we know is just the view. If you want to actually build an app, you're probably going to need like a router and like, you know, all these different pieces to put together. And then when one of these libraries gets updated, you have to like make sure you're keeping everything up to date. At this point, I think it's like stabilized a little bit. You know, we have like, everyone's decided like, for the most part, I think Webpack is like the module editor we're going to use. And Flux is our like, you know, architecture pattern we're going to use. Yeah. So I wanted to show you real quick.
Yeah. Also, I had a question.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
So my question was actually about Angular 2. You were talking about how it kind of, so React uses something called props and like a props chain if you're not using like the Flux architecture to kind of send data between components. Like pretty much you start with the main app component and you know, you go down the tree.
Yeah.
And you said Angular is pretty similar how it sends data between components down the tree. Does it have a sort of dispatcher or a way to kind of send data from one component to another without having to traverse the entire tree?
Yeah, so you have something called events, the event emitter.
Okay, so that
And,
sounds like it's probably like the dispatcher.
I think so. It's kind of similar to in Angular 1 you had this like root scope dot emit where you could like emit events from like way down below and then catch them higher up. And event emitter is kind of their Angular 2's version of that.
Okay. Does it allow you to, you were saying like with root scope it allows you to catch events kind of higher up the tree, but does it allow you to like send events to like, you know, sister components kind of at the same level or maybe even below of a separate?
It would.
Okay.
You can emit events to different scopes, like whether you want to go like globally or just, there is like some level of control. Again, not an expert on that just yet, but.
I think you can do two-way binding between your directives as well, right? In Angular 2. So like when you're going from the main component and then hero detail,
Yeah.
you did like the square brackets for input, right?
Yeah.
And then did at input. I know in a previous version of Angular 2, you're able to do like two-way binding as you would do in Angular 1, where your child component and your parent component can kind of communicate, and as it updates.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
you'd use like ng model or two-way binding in Angular 1.
Yeah, you can do that. I don't know if that would be like a sound idea for if you're trying to go through like 4 or 5 different components. If you had like this crazy big component tree. I know like one of the big complaints about Angular 1 was that ng model, specifically like two-way data binding, is hard to follow. So I don't know I think that's something you could do. I just don't know if it's something you would want to do. Okay.
They're a little bit late, so
That's
I don't know.
That's no problem. The only thing I just wanted to show really quick, like what this would look like actually compiling. Oh. Maybe. Hold on a sec. Cool. So this is, I was initially thinking about like having you guys like make this crazy like branch of all these different phases, but I thought Plunker would be a little simpler. But just to show you like how the TypeScript is actually compiling, the way they set you up in, what's that? Oh yeah, sure, yeah. So yeah. So what we're gonna do is like we're going to navigate to the directory where our project is set up. We're gonna run npm start, which this is, so Node Package Manager is kind of the way they encourage you to go about this. And let's see. What it's gonna do is it's just gonna sit there and listen for your changes. So in our package.json here, yeah. So we have this TSC TypeScript compiler. There are a few different ways you can compile TypeScript. Like some IDEs have this like built into them. I know Visual Studio does. But if you're using Node.js, you have to actually install it. And we have this script start. So when I ran npm start, what that ran was both a server, so we'd have a local server, and then also this TypeScript, and TypeScript-W, which I think is watch. So what that's basically doing is just looking at every .ts file and watching it for changes. So you'll see if I come in here to like, let's see, like app, oh, sorry.
This app that you have, is that created from the CLI?
No, this is actually from that same tutorial.
Okay.
Um,
Well, I was just saying, like the package.json you showed, was that all out of the box? 'Cause it seems like there's a lot of stuff there that would be useful.
Yeah, just a second here. Where is that guy? Yeah, I haven't taken a whole lot of time to look through this. They, out of the box, they give you a package to compile TypeScript, server, your typings, which is going to have like definition files for TypeScript. We have Zone.js. We talked a little bit about this Angular 2 in-memory web API. It's kind of neat. I didn't get too far into it, but it pretty much like lets you like mock out services, like calls to HTTP services. Yeah, so there is a lot going on. They also include everything you need to start like writing unit tests. So we have this whole, like in our app, we actually have these specs. So this is like an example of what one of these unit tests would look like. We also have a whole folder for like end-to-end tests. Other than that, like, this is just like a configuration I added to like make this. My plan was to have like all these different phases like running on different ports, but I decided against that. So, but yes, you would definitely want to have this compile step in your process, however you do this. Cool. Well, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to let me know, and I'll try to talk to the people who had questions that I couldn't answer and see if we can figure out some of that stuff. But I appreciate you guys all coming out, and had a lot of fun. Hopefully you guys learned something and have a better idea of if this is something that you want to keep learning about. So thank you.